Now we are joined by Kevin Pelton, the machine of ESPN, to talk some college basketball prospects. The NBA draft lottery quickly approaching. May 12th is in the back of my head now. And the Blazers, Lord knows, they could pick anywhere between 3 and 13 at this point. KP, thanks for taking some time to join us, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I don't think the draft lottery is approaching as quickly as it was the last few years in Portland, though, right?
Yeah, no, it's well. Check with me next week. with the gap seemingly closing with the Blazers, whether it's getting into the play-in, which they are now 2 games out of heading into tonight's action, but they are also less than a half game, I believe, with the Bulls winning last night, out of the 8th seed. It is that compression that we usually see. Towards the back of the lottery, or excuse me, towards the back of the play-in, is also now impacting that 7 through 12 or 13 spot as it pertains to the draft lottery. Yes, the Trailblazers, are a game ahead of the Chicago Bulls, as well as a game ahead of the San Antonio Spurs and a game and a half of the Miami Heat when you're talking about the front end of the lottery. KP, you have the Northwest vantage, but you have the outside vantage point of not being in the building night in, night out in Portland. When you look at what this team is doing, where do you fall on them going after the play-in versus maybe steering into the skid a little bit, and kind of what makes sense for the franchise overall?
Well, the one tough thing is it looks like a very strong draft at the top, led by Cooper Flagg, who I think deserves to be considered a generational type of number 1 pick, like an above average, way above average number 1 pick. And then, plenty of depth behind him between Dylan Harper and B.J. Edgecombe Jr. and Ace Bailey and so forth. So it wasn't maybe the best year to take this step, but the reason I think I'm in favor of the Blazers going for it, besides the fact that it's just been so long, March and April, for Blazers fans the last couple of years with the team trying to maneuver down in the lottery positioning, is this is being driven by the young guys, Monty Kamara and Denny Avdia and, Donovan Clingan nest starting, Scoot Henderson's development, Jaden Sharp. Like, these are the guys who are your future. It's not something where it's sort of chasing, a slim chance at a play-in run with a bunch of aging players. These are the guys, if you're having success in getting in the play-in run, it's because you don't necessarily need that much more young talent. Now, you could still probably use a centerpiece of this group, and that's where winning the lottery and moving up into the top 3 or 4 would be so great for the Blazers, but I don't think that they need to be sweating out every win at this time of the year in terms of how it affects their positioning for the draft.
With the Blazers right now, obviously a lot of fans are still upset about the tanking aspect, wanting to get a top pick. Give me some reasons why the Blazers could be frisky if they do get into that play-in game scenario. Could they possibly go on a run and find themselves in that second play-in game for the 8th seed, or could they possibly even get to that 8th seed if they're able to catch up to the Phoenix Suns, who are in 10th right now?
Yeah, I'd be really surprised if they ended up making the playoffs entirely, but I do think there's a pretty big gap between the top 8 in the West and everyone else. I mean, we've seen the Clippers, when Kawhi Leonard is playing like he has this past week, I think they're, a legitimately scary postseason team. So I think there's a difference between them and even the 9th seed with Sacramento, and then obviously a big gap to everyone else is what's opened the door for the Blazers. But, the experience of playing meaningful games for some of these young guys, I think would often be quite useful. And certainly for the fan base, too, after the last few years. We haven't, witnessed a lot of games like that. And they're a lot of fun to be part of.
We're joined by Kevin Pelton of ESPN. We've got, obviously, the NCAA tournaments going on right now, and one of the guys that was massive in that run last year, and your modeling loved him. The Blazers ended up drafting him in Donovan Clingan. Who, right now, when you're taking a look at the data and the modeling, who stands out as a stark contrast to maybe the way that some of the mocks, particularly that Jonathan and Jeremy have at ESPN, put together? Who's kind of a standout guy that's maybe on the data side profiles a lot better or a lot higher than maybe some of the eye test or feel as the mock drafts are currently shaking out?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this draft is there is a lot of overlap between those two, but the guy who probably pops in the projections relative to where he is still in the mock draft is Con Knippel from Duke. And when I incorporated the data from the Nike EYBL AAU tournaments, that's what caused him to shoot all the way up to number 2 in my consensus projections, behind only Cooper Flagg and ahead of Dylan Harper and BJ Edgecombe Jr., who had been, kind of neck and neck for second much of the season before I incorporated that. So, someone who I think similar to Klingon, you wonder if he has the absolute upside of guys like Harper and Edgecombe and Ace Bailey, but can come in and capably fill a role with his combination of shooting and size. It's pretty hard for a player like that to not at least be a rotation caliber player.
As a Blazer fan, what teams should those fans be watching in the tournament for players that could possibly end up in Portland with the success that the Blazers have had? Should they be looking at what's going on in like St. Mary's, Vanderbilt? Should they be looking at maybe what's going on with Colorado State and some of the players that they have? Where should the Blazer fans be watching?
Yeah, you've got some players on these teams making runs that are affecting the stock, and I think it's a little tougher to say that one specific team, because the range for the Blazers at this point with that lottery pick in particular is so wide open. I mean, Duke is still always a good team to watch because we're talking about 3 guys in the lottery. It would be surprising certainly if the Blazers went after Kamen Malawach, given that they did just draft Donovan Klingon and as overloaded as they are at center. But Knippel, I think certainly if you're in that back half of the top 10, is someone who could be in consideration. I think Illinois with Kasparas Yakichonis, potentially if he slides a little bit, is someone to watch if they can, go a couple of rounds in the tournament here. But, maybe some second rounders on some of these teams that are making runs from the 11 and 12 seeds.
KP, one of the things I was interested in having you on here is talking about the modeling and the data and how all of the projections have kind of, or if they have, shifted at all as the NIL impact and guys staying around. And you're seeing rosters, particularly this year, being a lot older, or maybe the oldest they've ever been in the modern era, as so many players are still around from the post-COVID year or a JUCO transfer year or something along those lines. Has there been any impact with some of those guys where you've seen them very similar to Dalton Connect last year, coming from a Northern Colorado, then going to a major program like Tennessee? Are there any of those guys that are maybe getting a bit more juice numbers or not reflected as well, particularly with somebody like Bennett Sturgeon Drake, who comes from a Division II and maybe doesn't have the data behind it, but has been so productive in such a unique situation, playing the literal slowest pace in college basketball?
Yeah, and that's somebody who really popped in the model even before, scouts started talking about him as a sleeper. So, we were kind of ahead on the Sturts thing of his breakout this week in the NCAA tournament. So that was cool to see. I think it's like kind of evolving the science behind it right now, because historically what the numbers said is if you came into the league, 23 and older, your chances of being successful were not very good. And sometimes that gets sort of paraphrased as, the problem is that you don't have any upside if you're that old. And I don't think that was ever the case. I think it was just a little more uncertain whether the success you had in college, was that just a product of having so much more experience than everyone else you were going up against, or age, is the case may be. I mean, a name that Portland fans are going to be familiar with, Chris Duarte, as an example of that, is someone who was seen as, this is an extremely safe prospect because he's so developed, he's going to be able to contribute right away. And instead, we've seen him struggle to stay in the league, unfortunately. And that was pretty common. But now that you have more guys that are staying several years, and partially in part because of the fact that they might be able to make more money in college than they can in the NBA, maybe that throws that off. So, I think Connect has certainly outperformed how he looked in my projections. Quentin Post with the Warriors, who's become a really good and valuable backup center for them as a second-round pick, is another interesting example of that. So looking at this year's draft, it'll be interesting to see which of these guys kind of can shake off that older status. Chaz Lanier is someone I look at on Tennessee. He's only a 4-year player, but had kind of similar to Dalton Connect, was playing at a lower level at North Florida, came to Tennessee, filled Connect's spot and has been similarly productive offensively. So, we'll see if I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick like Connect was or talked about as a lottery pick, but someone who I definitely think can come in and contribute right away off the bench.
That leads to an interesting conversation, too, because as you look at the NFL with quarterbacks, it feels and seems like quarterbacks that stay for a longer time in college develop at a higher rate, and then they come into the NFL, they hit the ground running. Just looking at Jaden Daniels, is that a move that we could see in college basketball as more players tend to stay and get the development that they need, as opposed to coming into the league a little bit raw and hoping that they'll develop in a pro system? Are they able to do that now in college?
I still think it's going to be better for the top prospects to come into the NBA. The one element of this is college basketball is just a very different style of play than the NBA, where it's so much more post-centric. You've got a lot more ability to hide players defensively. It's more difficult to build your offense, around the individual skills of the best players. So all of those elements, I think, if you're a top prospect, that's talking that Cooper Flagg, depending on who gets the number one pick, that he should maybe consider going back to Duke because that's preposterous to me. You're still making those endorsements in the NBA. You're starting your rookie contract and you're playing against the best players in the world. But if you're, somewhat of a borderline second-round pick, I think that's where it starts to become more interesting and more legitimate. Okay, let's give this another year, see if I can boost my stock. But even if not, I'm probably still making as much at the college level as I would on a two-way contract in the NBA, or maybe even more.
The Axel Lindeborgs of the world, as it were.
Right.
I want to get you out on this one, KP, because this is actually something that's been kind of in the back of my mind looking at the evaluation process and the umbrella that is NIL and what it has done to college basketball, not only for the U.S. students and U.S.-born players, but the influx of European players. And I'm wondering just if there's been any data points. I know the sample size is going to be just so small, but there has been a massive influx of European players over the last 2 years into college basketball. Has there been any trends, or have you noticed any trend lines of those players, of particular success markers or trailing markers as far as what they do or don't have as far as projections to the NBA, or any differences between them and the American-born players?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're probably going to take a few more years for the data to shake out, for there to be enough of a sample of those type of players. But it is definitely something that's noticeable, and it's sort of reflected on the interesting fact that after we've had non-Americans, in both cases French players, go number one the last 2 years in the draft with Wembanyama and Zachary Arisa-Shea this year, that it's entirely possible that we might not have an international player in the lottery at all this year. I think Noah Senge probably will end up in that spot. Mm-hmm. He's someone that also comes out really well statistically. But Igor Demin is an example of someone who, in the older model probably would have stuck it out in Spain and just been drafted from there, as we've seen so many players, but instead decided to come over for a year at BYU. And, I don't know if it changes his trajectory at all, but it certainly changes our knowledge of him as American fans, where we've been able to watch him now in this NCAA tournament run.
KP, hey, man, I just want to say thanks for your time. We always appreciate it. We'll see if we can check back in with you in a couple weeks when you're down here for Hoop Summit, and we're looking at the next generation of both the U.S.-born and international stars.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
All right, thanks. Kevin Pelton of ESPN joining us here live from the Stadium Sports Bar and Grill here at Ilani Casino Resort.